Good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure for me to be here. And so in the coming hour or so, I will try to share with you. Yeah, this is better? Okay. I will share with you our experience in Belgium specifically, but it's basically representative for how we produce pigs in Europe. So just very shortly on who we are. As you can see, this is our team. So we are a consultancy and services company with 2 veterinarians. We are 3 technical people and then someone who is involved in the data management. So let's say that one of our focuses is digital transformation, data analytics, and field trial. So to start out, in Belgium we have a production and a sow census that has been dropping down quite a bit. This is what you can see in this graph here. So the top color, the let's say grayish blue, is the number of sows, where you can see that in 2005 we were still having 470,000 sows, more or less. By, let's say, last year, this was going down to 350,000. So you see quite a rapid decrease. If you look, however, at the production level of the fatteners, there you can see that even though it has been going down, it's a rather mild decrease. And so, as you can see on the map, so this is Belgium, we have the Netherlands, Germany and France surrounding us. And most of the production actually is happening in the northern part of the country. So where we have very, very dense areas of production, can be challenging in terms of health management. To give you an idea about the type of farms that we have, there is very little integration. We also don't work most of the time in COPs, but actually, let's say that about 85% of our sows are belonging to family-owned farrow to finishing farms, which have an average size in sows about 250 to 300 animals. So when we look a little bit more in detail on why we have actually quite limited drop in fatteners, it's explained by this graph. So here you see over a period of about, let's say, 20 years, the number of pigs weaned per sow. And you can see that actually here we have made quite a big step forward, weaning about, let's say, 10 piglets averagely more now than we were doing 20 years ago. This was mainly the result of the use of hyperprophyllic sows. In terms of the tendency, however, what we see today is that actually the market share of the hyperprophyllic sows is going down a bit, while there is a tendency towards sows that are, let's say, a little bit more easy handling and robust. And so in terms of management, the way that we are producing is mainly within production system of batches. For years, the most popular, because of economic reasons, has been the 4-week batch system. The big disadvantage, however, there is that you're dealing with very early weaning ages. So averagely, your pigs will be around 19 to 20 days max. The other systems are, let's say, more or less in steady state for the 3-week batch system. What we have based, looking at the decrease in the 4-week, is actually taking a little bit more for a 5-week batch system, so having weaning ages of around 28 days. And so if we look at, let's say, the number of farms, what you can see in this picture here is that we have a steady decrease in number of farms. Today, let's say we're talking about 3,000, but at the same time, and I think this is the case for a lot of European and even worldwide situation, is that the average size of the farm is increasing. Comes with that if we look at the number of people working in farms in terms of activities going from 2000 to 2020, you see also quite a decrease. The other thing that is quite interesting though to see is that the proportion of external employees, so apart from the families that own the farm, this proportion is increasing. And if you look at well, let's say the age categories or the distribution of people working and owning the farms, what we see is that the average age is increasing. And so today, more than 50% of our farmers are over 55 years old. However, the people that remain in the farms, what we see in tendency as well, is that the average educational level is higher. It's much more challenging today to be a good farmer than it was, let's say, 30 years ago. And it explains also why we see the tendency of being more involved with looking at data, analyzing them, and managing your farm accordingly. So if you look a little bit more into the detail on the market situation, you will understand that we have, let's say, been facing quite rough times, and that in terms of our economics, we are very trade dependent. In this slide, you can see the overall production in tons of pigs produced on a yearly basis. So it's more than 1 million tons of products. Majority actually of the pigs are slaughtered in Belgium. So you see that we only have a minimum export of live animals. And so at the end of the day, even though that the average Belgian is trying quite hard to eat his proportion of pork, about 2/3 of everything that is slaughtered in Belgium is exported. And so if you look at what it means in terms of piglet prices and carcass prices, I have brought you here an overview of the price per piglet, 25 kilogram piglets, let's say over the last 6 years. So if you look over a period of time, what you can see clearly is that at the beginning of the year, averagely, our prices are higher, so that's the good thing. However, if you look over the last years, what you see as well is that prices have been extremely low, quite varying as well, and quite often due to external factors that, as a farmer, there is not much you can do about it. Here, for example, in 2018, we had an outbreak of African swine fever. This was an outbreak within wild boars, so it had nothing to do with our domestic animals. However, we lost the status of ASF-free, and this had really, really big consequences on our trade. At the same time this year, for example, what you see on the top curve, with the absolute top, let's say, in terms of prices, is that due to the Rosalia strain in Spain, so this is a PRRS virus that is European, but however quite virulent, they were lacking piglets, and more particularly at this age group. So you see that we had this summertime a really big export to Spain, for example, increasing the prices of our piglets quite a bit. And so, for example, here, if you look at the carcass prices, it's a quite similar tendency. This is just to illustrate you, for example, the impact of COVID. So in 2020, yes, indeed. In February, we went into lockdown, and you see that the demand for meat was going down tremendously, together with that, also prices. And so opposite to prices, the tendency for feed is what you see here. So this is in euros per ton for piglets, for sows, and for fatteners. You can see that actually over the years through, the prices have been increasing quite steadily until the Ukraine war, where the increase no longer was steadily, but really huge all of a sudden. So putting all those previous factors together, what we're seeing today, it's the number of pigs slaughtered per month, is that we do have been facing a decrease with, or let's say mainly, because of the sales of the piglets this summer and a reduced sow census. So today we are, let's say, at our bottom production level. And so to give you a little bit of a grasp on what it means in terms of earning models, I brought here, let's say, 2 reference years. And the numbers that you're seeing here is actually coming from a monitoring system in Belgium that involves 600 farms. So this is an average of somewhat larger, somewhat smaller farms. But the green bar shows the overall income. So the very big impact of prices on the sales is actually depicted here, because if you see in 2019, for example, versus 2021, a same sales was actually resulting already in a difference of more than 150,000 euros. So even if you were doing everything the same, let's say your return, your profit was going down. If you look then here at the cost side, where basically the variable costs such as feed make a very big chunk of it, what we see is that at the same time in 2019, for example, the expenses were much lower than they were in 2021. So as a result, what you're left with here at the end of the day, and this is what your earning is as a farmer, 2019 was a good year with quite some profit after even the payment of the farmer on yearly base, while in 2021, you see that actually the farmers were struggling, many of them having negative results, or let's say the better ones break even. And so if we put this more historically, as what you can see in this graph, here we have prices, here we have a time period, and the latest results are actually from the beginning of this quarter, where the orange bar is showing you the sales prices of the pigs, the let's say pink bar or pink graph is showing you the feed price accordingly. What you can see is that actually whenever these prices are above the pink ones, these are the years where actually the farmers are making money. In between, we've had several years of actually very tough times for the farmers because of the very high feeding cost and low sales prices. So you can see here now we are at the start of where the two graphs are crossing again, and that's a very good news because we know today again our farmers are making money. Just to illustrate you, and as you probably can imagine, when you're facing these type of periods, it's really, really required to look very good at your production data, at your costs and your profits, because otherwise you don't have built up enough, let's say, backup to overcome these periods of very low to negative incomes. And so if we then move on to the next part of the presentation, where we will be looking not longer into the market, but at farm level, the next slide, I did a split up. So first part, we are looking into the situation of a sow farm, delivering piglets at the age of about 10 weeks, so 25 kilograms. The very last part, we will be looking more into a situation of fattening farms. And so here you see basically a cost distribution pattern for piglet production, where it's quite clear that a very big chunk here, over 50%, is made up by the feeding cost. So when we're coming back later on into production data, you will hear me say quite often, we're looking at feed conversion rate, we're looking at feed uptake. If you see this, I think you can clearly understand why. Another item that is also quite important in our situation, and that's making up 15% of the production cost, is infrastructure. What does it mean? It is the building as such, obviously, but this is also covering, for example, heating costs, electricity costs. And these later are quite expensive in our market, in our situation. So if you go a little bit more into detail, you always have, let's say, the profit side and the cost side. So here I made the split up for you in terms of the profit side, and you see that's quite simple. It's depending on the sales of your piglets and some reformed sows. If we look at the cost side, it's a little bit longer, but I put them here up front, sow feed and piglet feed. We will see some actual prices later on, and above all, the tendency over the last year. The purchasing of your gilts, and I put here specifically purchase, because in our situation, most of the farmers, they purchase the gilts externally, so we have very few of them that have self-replacement situations. The ladder down here, veterinary costs, water, electricity, well, depending on the time, there is a little bit more opportunity to go into detail. So if we look at the parts of the piglets, some of the production parameters, they will not be so surprisingly to you either, but, oops, sorry, wrong one. What I've put here is like averages and targets. I think it's more important to talk about the tendencies and the evolutions that we're facing today. But if you look at farrowing rate, for example, the target for us, minimally, would be 85%. If you're looking at the farrowing index, you see here this is the national average between 2.13 and 2.37. But the point with the farrowing index, obviously, is that you have a few factors that you really can't change much about it. The length of your pregnancy, maybe depending on the genetics that you're choosing for, it's going to be a few days longer or shorter, but that's it. The length of lactation, there we do see a big increase because, as I mentioned earlier, in the 4-week batch systems, we had early weaning ages. Today, there is a tendency of increasing. I will come back later to why. This one, the non-productive days, are marked in yellow because, yes, there, as a farmer, this is something that you have a big role to play in. And these are, let's say, mistakes or items that you need to analyze in your data and try to find out if, things aren't according to the targets, why that is. So here for us, if we are, let's say, talking with our customers, this is an important aspect. And so if you then look at obviously very important factor here is the number of weaned piglets per litter. It's quite determined for a part on the number of born alive pigs, but we do here also see some changes in tendencies. By that I mean that in the past, actually, this was really, really important for making our strategic choices. Today, there is a tendency to looking at other aspects of your piglet's quality. So rather than numbers, we have a shift towards sows that have focus on piglet fertility, birth weights, colostrum uptake, or at least colostrum provision. And the reason for that is that along the way, what we found out is that if you want to have a nursery unit with limited mortality, colostrum uptake is really important. So if you're here with like a lot of born piglets alive, this is a challenge. Also, if your piglets are not heavy enough, the fertility isn't there, again, this colostrum uptake is quite tough. The other point, apart from mortality, that is getting a lot of attention in our production systems in Europe, but I'm sure it's coming everywhere, is the reduction of antibiotics. And there again, it's one of the reasons why our weaning age is going up, and where we're looking or having a focus on these parameters in terms of the type of piglets that we want to see born. And so what I want to discuss with you next is an example of how we are looking at data to make decisions. I will first shortly tell you about the history of this farm. What we will see next, and what I will try to explain short but clearly, is how the antibiotic consumption for our country is determined and judged. So if we're looking here, this is a sow farm that traditionally was having quite some problems with Streptococcus suis in the nursery units. And because of that, the antibiotic consumption was high, quite elevated. One of the, let's say, ways that we can fight Streptococcus is the use of arthrovaccines. And because of, let's say, expense limitations, what we will do is vaccinate the sows, so we transfer, let's say, the maternal antibodies through the colostrum. This particular case, after introducing this vaccination, the improvement was very, very little. And then you have a whole bunch of potential explanations for that. But one of the other items that we checked at that particular farm was also the presence of verotoxigenic E. coli, because we see indeed that in some cases there's quite a correlation between having issues with Streptococcus and the presence of verotoxigenic E. coli. So here you see the results of a vero check, something I will not go into. People will explain much better after me how it's done. Anyways, after this was observed, we chose to also start vaccinating piglets rather than only focusing on, let's say, the Streptococcus as such. So to illustrate you how we are reporting and monitoring antibiotic consumption, this is basically an official governmental program, but as a veterinarian, every time that you provide a farmer with antibiotics, this has to be reported. And you also need to specify if you are going to be using these antibiotics in weaned piglets, non-weaned piglets, fatteners, or sows. What they do afterwards is there is this calculation model for the use of these antibiotics, but basically I would like to define it as saying that this BD100 value, if you need to interpret it, you could say it's the number of days that an animal is treated over a period of 100 days. And so basically there were certain targets that are set. Here what you see, for example, is the action or the reference value. You want to be below here. If you're in the yellow zone, then let's say there's no consequences yet, but you should start paying attention. But the moment that you are over this action value, then you are identified as being a red farm. Like red is never a good color, right? And it means that there could be penalties. Now, these values, they are different depending on the age categories. If we look, for example, specifically to the weaned piglets, as was in this farm, today the value is set at 40. It used to be 50, and as you see, we have not reached the bottom yet, because in 2024, the maximum value that will be allowed will be 30. And so if you now go back to the example of this farm, what you can see here is actually the evolution in time. So when we initially started out, we see that over a period of a year, the average value for the BD100 was almost 80. So here we are in a situation of only using the auto vaccine. Afterwards, we introduced hipravepured in the piglets, and within 6 months, you immediately see that actually the use in antibiotics has been going down tremendously. As a typical question and logic question was then, well, you know, can we not manage it with only using hipravepured, and we forget about the auto vaccine for the sows? So we tried that as well in terms, or it's as a purpose to be cost depending. But what was really striking is that at the moment that we stopped the auto vaccine, again, our consumption was going up again. So it was basically a proof for us that we needed a combination of both in order to be able to, as we were again afterwards when we started up the treatment of both, going underneath this target level of a BD100 below 30. And if you look a little bit more in detail, apart from the overall consumption, another item that we saw, and this is also specifically monitored because colistin is one of those molecules that we need to use quite carefully, is what you can see that before we started actually using hipravepured, we had monthly quite high consumption of colistin required, while the moment that we introduced this vaccine, it's not going down to 0, but you can see that there are several batches, and every month is a new batch that we were able to go through without any use, and also at several times. I think this is not very clear to you, but this scale is different from that one. So the overall value also for the BD100 for colistin, when we were using it, was quite lower. So other than, let's say, the side of the piglets, you have also the sows. There are the two important factors, replacement rates. And I must say that today we are aiming for a replacement rate of 45%. We have seen that actually in terms of productivity, this is what you need more or less to be at maximum levels. Mortality rate, on the other hand, it's also marked in yellow, because when we were talking earlier about the type of genetics that we work with the high proliferate sows, this can be a challenge. And we see that today people are sometimes making choices to have a reduction in sow mortality. So where in the past, I can say historically, we were looking very much at the first part of what we have been discussing, being productivity. Being so tough to have enough margin, actually today we have quite a big, let's say, emphasis on the cost side as well. Unfortunately, we won't be able to go through all of these aspects very much in detail, but one of the points that I want to refer to is the fact that today, when we're looking at cost of sow and piglet feed, we're actually working with particular targets in volume that they need. On the other hand, for example, some other items that are quite interesting is to see that when we're talking about veterinary cost, water, electricity and heating, from farm to farm, there are very big variations. So this is another aspect that in many farms today, we still need to revise, I think, more in detail, because there's still quite a lot to gain. So in here, I brought to you an illustration of some of the measurements that are being implemented or will be implemented in the future when it comes to reducing, for example, energetic costs. apart from the financial aspect, what we're facing as well is basically a lot of pressure when it comes to CO2, ammonium, phosphor reduction measurements, more from a governmental side and from a cost-effective side. But for example here, what you see are 3 different graphs on, let's say, measurements that are already being implemented today. Let's say type of measurements or adjustments that are close to implementation or relatively new. And here on the bottom line, you see, let's say, what we're looking at for the future. In terms of interpretation, because this is being calculated specifically for what it means in terms of CO2 reduction, and every single bar here that is colored represents a reduction of 10% CO2. So you see that actually today already there are quite some possibilities that are being implemented, and that actually are quite also good, quite cost effective. So you can see that here, for example, the cost for a ton of CO2 is less than €1, okay? There are some others, like insulation, for example, that require much more of an investment to have a similar reduction of CO2. And so if we're now moving on to the next situation, being a fattening farm, there you see there's much less parameters to take into account. On the profit side, we're only looking at the sales of the fatteners, obviously. When it comes to the cost side, you see it's also much more easy, much more simple. But what I would like to focus on with you for the time that we've left is showing you some illustrations on how farmers are being paid for their fattening pigs. And there, it's important, I think, to understand that within our market, we have basically 2 kinds of targets. As I told you from the introduction, we have a lot of exports of pig meat. And in these cases, slaughterhouses really are looking at quantity. Quality is, let's say, much less of a goal, of an issue. On the other hand, we do have, of course, also the local consumption, fresh meat. And there, in these cases, parameters such as fat, thickness, taste, ham size, etc., are much more important. And that has a big consequences for the way that the farm is being paid. So if we're going a little bit more in detail, here you see an example of a slaughterhouse that is producing quite a bit for the local market. And even for that, they created their own labels called Taste and Welfare. You can see here a lot of tables and parameters, but this is actually the way that we will be determining the price. So we have the basic price, which are just the euros per kilogram of live weight, nothing quite unusual there. Then they have a bonus related to the weight range of the animals, which is still relatively basic. But then you see here a whole list of additional parameters. And it is actually all of these parameters that can make the difference between having profit or losing money as a producer. So for example here, if you look at quality, this is basically determined on the results of the autopharm in the slaughterhouse, and then every carcass is classified and gets a certain qualification, going from 1 to 15. If you're within the first 9 classes, you can see you're doing good, because it means that you will get a bonus on top of your normal payment. Whilst if you're going under a certain level, starting from 10, or 9, it actually means that you're getting penalties, okay? And the same, let's say, methods are applied for weight ranges, as you can see here in this table. All the requirements that are connected to taste and welfare itself, that means just that the slaughterhouse is actually making a whole index of actions that you need to do as a farmer. But this can be just as well, referring to the density of your piglets in setup. It can be the use of renewable energy sources. So this is nothing 100% in relation to your productivity. And then looking at some other aspects, it's overall labels, but also items related to CO2 reduction. What does it mean in this case? Actually, the bigger the batches of fatteners that you're delivering to the slaughterhouse, the higher your bonus will be as well. And so if you compare this with another type of slaughterhouse, this one, for example, is mainly a slaughterhouse going for export and somewhat more into bulk production. And I don't know what's the situation here in Korea, but in Belgium and in Europe all over, the castration is becoming like a big discussion point on animal welfare, and people are looking for alternatives. So one of that is using immunocastration. However, the question there is, well, you know, can we, by immunocastration, gain the money that we need when we are being paid by the slaughterhouse? And so here I just give you an illustration of a comparison where we had a group of boars that were immunocastrated and a group of boars that was intact, with every time the results for different parameters. And looking at first impression, because boars were in the stables exactly the same time period, you would seem to have the impression that you're doing quite better, okay? Because your weights are heavier, your carcass weights are better, and even the classification, because for this particular case, the lower the value, the better the quality. You would expect to have actually an advantage by using immunocastration. However, if you're looking into more detail, you see that here there is a correction factor applied. This one is, let's say, quite roughly, and it holds, for example, indicators such as fat thickness, meat percentages, and what you see is that actually for the intact boars, because this 5.8, what it means it is that from your live weight, they will subtract 5.8 kilograms to determine your payment. So we see that here, actually, there is a very, very minor difference between both, and even slightly higher in the immunocastrated boars. And so actually, when you do the analytics properly, and you're looking at what is the price of your feed per kilogram of paid meat in euros, which is actually your revenue, you will see that with the immunocastrated boars, we were higher than with the intact boars. So there, for me, the message is, as a producer, really know what you're being paid for. Because in our case, there's so much difference from one slaughterhouse to the other, that it can be that this situation is completely different when you're taking your fatness to another slaughterhouse. And so one of the last slides then is just an illustration that I want to give you when it comes to the cost side, because we have been talking about revenue, but here in cost side, what is striking, for example, is that when we're talking about variable costs in fattening units, there was much less to gain and much less variability. In terms of growth and feed conversion rates, that's where really the margin is. However, if you look at the evolution over the last 20 years, what you will see is that in terms of growth, we have been going up quite a bit, more than 100 grams a day. In terms of feed conversion rate, we also were very efficient in dropping. And here I think that actually for the coming years, we will not be able to make a similar progress as we have over the last years. And so as a take-home message, what I would like to transfer to you is that actually, first of all, the data collection and data analytics have become critical in times when the markets are very volatile and the margins are thin. However, this data registration is really a group effort, right? If you're working with more people in a farm, it's very important that everybody is strict applying it, and equally also knows what the definitions are that you have been using. Just to give you one practical example, if we're talking about gilts, when are we talking about a productive animal? Is it at a standard of 240 days, or is it after she has had her first insemination? This is just one example. And maybe my last part here to look at is to show you and hopefully illustrate to you that some management choices and changes that we need to take are consumer-driven and not that much productively-driven. And the challenge, I think, here in the future is to get that valorized as well. So there, I would like to thank you very much for your attention. As we would say in Dutch, dank u wel en kamsahamnida.